Want to call this special assembly meeting to order? Madam Clerk, please do the roll call. Here, ma'am.
Mr. Honeman? Ms. Gray Jackson?
Honored to be here.
Mr. Hall?
Here.
Ms. Johnston? Mr. Starr? Mr. Flynn? Mr. Steele?
Here.
Ms. Demboski? Present. Mr. Peterson?
Present.
Mr. Evans?
Here. Next item is the Pledge of Allegiance. Mr. Flynn, with those spiffy shoes, could you loosen the pledge, please, sir? Thank you, sir. Next item on our agenda is the only thing, item 4A, Assembly action on mayoral veto of budget items from the regular Assembly meeting of April 28th, 2015. So, to the administration, Mr. Wheeler, since you've researched this and it has historical precedent, which is a question some Assembly members may have, lead us down this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Assembly members, the overriding concept here is to move $2 million out of SWS into Fund 101 so that that money can be used in lieu of property taxes. To get there, there were some options, but most of those would put the Assembly in the position of extending the time we need to issue the tax levy, which would be the end result would be the loss of the opportunity to collect taxes a little earlier. So what you're left with is a mechanism by which to bring this issue to the body, make amendments, and then pass the end result as amended. In order to do that, you need to start with a motion to override the mayor's veto. While that is pending, we've proposed a series of amendments to the three pieces of legislation that we need to address. The first is to revise the utility budget to go ahead and take the $2 million from SWS and put it into Fund 101. The second step then is to amend the AR that makes the appropriations to reinstate $2 million worth of spending. Then the third step, the third motion, is to modify the mill levies so that they're adjusted to the amendments that have been made. And then at the end of that amendment process, the Assembly finishes the final vote on the override motion. And I've provided a script to all of you with the motions indicated in bold. The reason for this process is to make sure that all three items are in front of you together as a package so that we do that in the right sequence to make sure the end objective is reached. I have, as I indicated to you, Mr. Chairman, researched both case law and our own veto history to see how and if it had been done in the past. And this is the one example that I found where there was an effort and a desire to make amendments to a vetoed piece of legislation in the context of the override versus the other alternative, which is to have to reintroduce ordinances and resolutions and go back to the public hearing process again, which is not a convenient way to deal with the budget at this point, given the mill levy deadline. That example occurred in 1977. There's some advantages to having an example that old. One, in the 40 years since, the Assembly has had the opportunity to come up with some other process and hasn't. So there's a sense that the Assembly at that time and since has been satisfied with that process. Number two, it was contemporaneously close to unification. So you have folks that were involved in government at the time of unification and at the time of the formation of the charter who thought this was the right process to use. And thirdly, at the time, their counsel was the same counsel who represented the Charter Commission in creating the charter. In the case law side of it, I have found examples, they're all old examples out of this jurisdiction, and there's only a handful of them, but they essentially utilize this very similar process, and some of the judges equated it with the reconsideration process, where you bring up something for reconsideration, you make changes, and at the end you approve it as reconsidered and amended. So I feel comfortable that this is the right way to approach the resolution that we're trying to achieve here. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Gray Jackson has a question, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for clarification, okay, at last Tuesday's meeting, the Assembly approved 6-5, reimbursing solid waste services $4 million, okay? The Assembly also approved 10-1, putting $216,000 into Health and Human Services budget to deal with chronic inebriate issues. The Assembly also approved 7-4, putting $129,720 into Health and Human Services for a homelessness coordinator. The Assembly also approved 6-5, putting into Health and Human Services $273,980 to hire 3 additional animal control officers. And last, the Assembly also approved 7-4, $115,880 to provide funding for a entry-level senior planner to deal with the required marijuana land use regulations. So with that said, what's the status, based on what's before us, of what was approved by the Assembly last Tuesday in terms of our amendments? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Gray Jackson, the mayor's line item vetoes eliminate those items you just mentioned. Those were Assembly amendments 3 through 6. In addition, the mayor's line item vetoes reduce another $2 million in spending. The proposal is just to restore the $2 million. It's not to restore funding for those amendments you just mentioned.
Mr. Chairman, may I follow up, please?
Go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. I appreciate your explanation, okay? But when I read the mayor's veto, it's really not clear in terms of what the Assembly approved. And I just want a clarification, and we just got it. But besides that fact, I did read it, and unless I'm missing something, it's just not clear. And I just wanted to be clear, especially to the public, because if we don't quite understand it, I don't think they do either. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any other questions from Assembly members? Sir. Yes, Mr. Honeman.
I would like Mr. Jackson. I'm a little confused. I have not seen the videos. Currently at work, and I'm not clear. Is the administration asking the opportunity to override the veto, vote to override the veto, so that the $2 million would be taken from solid waste services, but then the other line items that were passed this past Tuesday would be eliminated?
Correct.
Mayor indicated that is correct. Other questions from Assembly members? Mr. Steele.
Well, as I understand what your motion is, then, if the $4 million that we put back is taken out already by the veto, then this revised budget actually leaves them with a reduction of more than the operating budget is $10.9 million, and in the budget book we started at 11.2. So they're actually going backwards from what was originally proposed. Is that true?
Through the chair, could you please repeat the question?
Yeah. The way I understand this amendment, the mayor's veto basically eliminated everything we did last time, and so that means that the money that was taken out of their reserves fund, the $5 million, actually 5.5, whatever, that does not go back into, that is stays out, and it actually ends up reducing their operating budget for 2015.
Through the chair.
Marilyn, could you speak into the microphone a little louder, ma'am?
Get it.
We have problems hearing you.
I'll take care of it, Mr. Chairman,
Okay.
if you may. Mr. Steele, that is not correct. The veto of your decisions on solid waste services undoes your decision and leaves their budget as it was before because the mayor's proposal to you did not pass. So the only change to solid waste services budget at all, sir, is if the Assembly moves forward on the amendments that are before you now, in which case their expenditure budget would be increased. Thank you.
Okay, so it's just a small reduction in the operating cost, a couple $100,000 or something like that. The proposed.
Yeah, essentially, as you remember, what I had originally proposed was taking $4 million,
Yeah.
2 into the trust fund, 2 into general government. We're not proposing taking the 2 into the trust fund. That'll stay with the utility, just the $2 million to replace property taxes in the general budget.
Thank you.
You bet.
Any question to the administration before we begin? Okay. What I'm going to need then is motion number 1 that's on there from the body. I need somebody to do it.
Mr. Chairman,
Ms. Gray Jackson.
I'm happy to do it. I hereby move to override the mayor's vetoes of AO 2015-42S as amended, AR 2015-107S as amended, and AO 2015-34S as amended, subject to additional motions. I need a second.
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Comments? Mr. Flynn.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to also thank Mr. Wheeler, who took some time with me this morning to discuss some of the backstory that you just heard and how he felt this was legal based on precedent. I'll be honest with you, I'm really struggling with it for 2 reasons. First and foremost is the effect of this process is to increase an appropriation to an agency, an enterprise, solid waste services collection utility, using a line item veto. A line item veto is used to reduce an appropriation, not to increase. And I find this very difficult to accept as an appropriate utilization of line item veto authority based on that. The second piece relates to post-passage revisitation of an amendment without a real reconsideration, but instead coming back to a piece of legislation and amending it after a veto. In my mind, and I will recognize Mr. Wheeler's discussion from 1977, either you reconsider a legislation as approved or you don't reconsider legislation as approved. You don't then make amendments to it. And so for those 2 reasons, I'm really struggling with the process that has been laid out before us. And as I mentioned to Ms. Demboski a few minutes ago, I'm pretty sure I pay the most personal property taxes of anybody on this body, so I like the idea of holding them down. But I'm really uncomfortable with taking $2 million from one of our utilities to offset property tax without a better thought out process for doing that. If we had worked on this 2 months ago and come up with a good mechanism, I might have been in better shape. But right now, I'm really struggling with that, and I am having a hard time accepting this approach. That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Mr. Starr.
I think we tend to get balled up in not trying to hide behind process thereof, but also it's necessary to understand what we're being asked to do. And I sort of concur only to the point of revisiting an item in this manner with Mr. Flynn, but we are talking about the budget and we are talking about a veto. So the idea that, you know, the normal reconsideration process and our whoops, we better come back and correct something we've already approved, perhaps doesn't apply here given the authority of the mayor to line item veto. So the idea that perhaps he says, hey, the $2 million tax, as Mr. Steele moved and passed, the $2 million property tax is something that he can't agree with. So the idea that he uses line item veto for that purpose, I feel is well within his bounds and well within our need to consider that to be the case. So if we get to that point, then it's our job, I believe, to further amend the items down below as suggested by him in a compromise, suggested by the mayor in the compromise. So the idea that we're sort of relying on historical methodologies is somewhat helpful, but not necessarily today's conversation. In my opinion, it's much more how do we walk out of here with a budget that we can live with. The ability to raise taxes can be foregone by the surplus in cash and capital by the utility that we own outright and everybody backs with the full faith and credit. So the logic of pulling back the surplus in cash from one of our utilities has no problem with me from the fact that have those utilities gotten in trouble, they would come to us as the full cash pool and say, help us out. We have a history of sort of blending the lines with borrowing money from Fund 181 to just surplus cash over to an assessor's department. We did that for $3.8 million back in the Begich administration, a fund transfer. We borrowed money from our Parks and Rec department out in Chugiak Eagle River for direct deposit into the fund to build a library. We've done interfund loans that sometimes don't get paid back. Sometimes they do. ML&P for land purchase on the Campbell track, the Campbell Creek track up in Muldoon comes to mind. So I want to walk out of here with a budget I can live with. I guess the spirit of compromise appears to be here as opposed to just sort of a red pen, take it or leave it and you figure it out. I don't feel like, based on conversations we've had, that that's what's happening, and I'd like to not turn it into that today. So my idea of at least getting to that would be my spirit of it. I'm interested in this because, Mr. Chairman, do we actually even have a veto on the table to override? Did it get moved? Did I get here late on that? Is that what happened?
It was mailed to you earlier today.
The actual veto? Okay, I've been away from my computers, so if that's out in front of us.
We're just bringing it to you, I think, or I can give you mine.
Nope, that makes sense then for Ms. Gray Jackson's motion, and I'll be happy to move the amendments as necessary. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Wheeler, sir.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I just wanted to clarify one thing for the record in case this ever comes up again. I know Mr. Flynn is concerned about the mayor's action on SWS's budget. I just wanted to clarify that he's not exercising the line item veto on that budget. He's actually vetoed that entire ordinance. It's the Assembly that now has in front of it the opportunity to put back from SWS to general government the $2 million. So the mayor is not, by line item veto, trying to increase funding. He's vetoed the ordinance in its entirety. The Assembly then has the opportunity to make the appropriation. So the reason for that is the mayor cannot, through line item veto, increase the appropriation. So that's why he's vetoed the entire ordinance. Thank you.
Ms. Johnston, ma'am.
And I was just going to mention that this would probably feel a lot different if it was done on Tuesday night when we were going through the budget process. We left things open. We did not reconsider the utility budget in case we needed to make adjustments. And as you're well familiar with, we have done this kind of sausage making on the night. But this feels a little odd because we're doing it the following Monday. But we have the whole purpose of not reconsidering the utility budget was in case we needed to make correction.
Anything else, ma'am? Ma'am, anything else? Okay. So, Mr. Wheeler, from our earlier discussion, we need to vote on this, or do you want us to suspend action on this vote?
Mr. Chairman, it's now appropriate to make the amendments and then have the final vote at the end.
Okay. The first one's going to have to be moved.
Mr. Chairman?
Ms. Gray
Thank
Jackson,
you, Mr. Chairman. I moved the first amendment, and I had a second, so we don't have to vote on that? I have to move, aren't we going to vote on individual amendments?
what you want to do?
overrides?
You want to, now, I
Amendments.
think from reading this, you want, I hereby move to amend 2015 42S as amended, by adding the following.
So in other words, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Wheeler, I need to go through everything on the front and back of this document before we vote?
Through the chair, Ms. Gray Jackson, you make the amendment regarding 42S. You vote by majority vote on that one. You make the amendment regarding 107S.
There's a break.
You vote in the majority on that one. You then move the third amendment, which is for 34S, and vote on that one by majority vote. And then at the end, you vote on the main override motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wheeler, I believe that that's what I just said. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Move forward.
Oh, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, ma'am.
I've already moved the first amendment, so we need to vote on that.
What you need to do.
Okay, I have it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All right, fine. I hereby move to amend AO 2015-42S as amended by adding the following. Section 2, notwithstanding Anchorage Municipal Code 2610-065, the sum of $2 million is hereby appropriated as a utility revenue distribution from the Refuge Collection Utility Fund 560 to General Government Area-wide Fund 101. The amounts set forth for the 2015 fiscal year are hereby revised and appropriated. The intent of this motion is to restore the appropriation of $2 million from the Refuge Collection Utility Fund to the area-wide general fund. I need a second. Thank you,
Who was
Mr.
the
Chairman.
second? Mr. Starr was the second. We'll need to vote on this one.
I have a question before we
Mr.
do.
Starr, go ahead, sir.
Through the chair, I guess, Mr. Mayor, the Tuesday night documents also specified sort of a summary of capital intentions, I guess, within solid waste services. One of them was, I thought, recycling and purchase of garbage trucks and some of that. Maybe recycling wasn't on that list. Have you had a chance to see that your office produced that document as well? That won't jeopardize that. The cash position is still pretty strong.
Yeah, those items were already incorporated into their capital budget.
Yeah.
And then Ms. Gaillard has done a financial analysis of cash flow for the utility over the next several years. They're in strong shape.
All right. And then the recycling question, as that was discussed through Mr. Steele's comments, is that still to come in front of the Assembly, or do you have an action plan on expanded recycling potentials?
Not at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments from Assembly members before we vote? Seeing none, Mr. Hall, will now vote. Mr. Honeman, you're first. Please vote.
No.
We're still missing one. Who's not voted? Oh. Okay. There. That's approved. Next one, Ms. Gray Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hereby move to override certain vetoes of AR 2015-107S as amended and line item vetoed, and amend the resolution by restoring the funding as indicated.
Second.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to go a little bit further so that folks know what we're restoring.
Go ahead, ma'am.
Community development, we're restoring $200,000. That was vetoed. Library, $100,000. Fire Department, $800,000. Parks and Recreation, $200,000. Police Department, $300,000. Public Works, $400,000. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, ma'am. Comments from Assembly members before we vote? Not seeing any. Mr. Honeman?
Yes.
That is approved. Next one, Ms. Gray Jackson, page 2.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hereby move to amend AO 2015-34S as amended at Section 39 to read as follows. Section 39. These rates may be adjusted to include amendments and any associated IGC impact as a result of the approved 2015 budget, including any amendments approved by the Assembly on May 4th, 2015. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'll need a second.
Yes, second.
Was seconded. Mr. Starr?
No, just some closing comments. Mayor, I appreciate you leaving the next administration, whoever that is, in pretty good shape from several factors. The fund balances have been restored, I believe, adequately. The idea that you've sent clear communicated messages to the various department heads would be the topic I'd like to talk about now. Is that I'm often startled by the amount of surplus that we generate. Obviously, I'm pleased, but when we generate larger surpluses at the end of the year, we've perhaps either created an environment where we tax more than we thought, or we didn't quite do a good enough job budgeting. And it's not to downplay the fact that we end up with a cash position or a positive, expense versus income situation. So what I would hope is that there isn't necessarily an overstatement of concern from your part that would force the department heads to get much more efficient. I'd much rather live with the budget that we've approved and end the year with the budget that we approved. That would be the ideal scenario. So if there's transitional discussions and places that you have budget weaknesses, could you certainly tell the Assembly about that sooner than later? That's helpful to have. We got surprised sometimes when the Begich administration transitioned. It wasn't as we represented. So let us help communicate the department heads in the transition as you see those financial questions. That would be my only pledge. Again, I'm happy to reach a compromise as opposed to a battle. So thank you for bringing clear facts to us.
You're welcome, Mr. Starr.
Ms. Gray Jackson, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, this was a compromise, and that's the only reason why I'm voting for it. I'm not real happy about taking anything from solid waste services because it's ratepayers' money, and I don't think ratepayers' money should go for for general government property tax relief. I'm adamant about not raising property taxes by any means, but we live in a community now, folks, where it's not 200,000 anymore. It's over 300,000 people. We are getting emails from folks all over the community because they're upset about the increase in crime in one way or another. The amendments that were brought forward by several of us and approved were all public safety amendments. I don't care what anybody say. They were all public safety amendments, and that's why we brought them forward. And they've been vetoed. They're gone. And just for the record, they were all area-wide funds that would have been used, and the area-wide assessed valuation is $34,950,868,687. So what that means that if these public safety amendments that we brought forward, and I'll tell you again what they were: a homeless coordinator. I mean, it's an issue. Animal control officers, dogs on the trails, it's an issue that we're hearing from people in this community. A senior planner to deal with the marijuana land use regulations, and also setting money aside to deal with chronic anevias. These are all public safety issues. And the cost that it would have been to you, the public, if these had been maintained, is if you have a $300,000 home, it would have cost you if you had a $300,000 home, it would have cost you $6.33 in additional taxes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, ma'am. Any other comments before we vote?
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Hoonman?
Yeah, Ms. Gray Jackson said it best. I'm not real happy with the fact that we're taking money from the ratepayers and all the services to reimburse the general fund in order to, if you will, show the tax rate savings. And I don't see that as fair. That's why I voted against that particular amendment override for that purpose. So I'm real sure that I'm going to support the budget in its entirety. I don't think it's going to make a difference, but I kind of will.
Thank you, Mr. Honeman. Please vote. We need your vote, Mr. Honeman. That is approved. Vote was 9-2. We now go back and pick up the first motion that was made by Ms. Gray Jackson, seconded by Mr. Steele. We'll vote on that one. Mr. Wheeler?
Mr. Chairman, just a reminder for the body that this is the vote on the motion to override. It does take 8 to approve the final package as amended.
Are you urging a yes or no vote?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. Mr. Honeman, please vote. That is approved by the body. The vote was 9-2. That item is approved. Mr. Mayor, I hope this will end the rest of the vetoes relative to the budget, sir. I appreciate the administration working with us. Unlike Juneau, we don't read an impasse on the budget. We don't get everything we want. I don't think either side does. But at least we work out a compromise that keeps this town functioning. The tax notices go out to the public.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. No, I do have until 5 o'clock tomorrow, but I do not anticipate any further action. I'd like to be the closure of the 2015 budget. Appreciate the Assembly and in the spirit of compromise. And just a couple quick notes. I know some people had concerns about taking money from SWS, but I would remind those people that we take a dividend from MLMP, which is a ratepayer-based organization, every year in the millions of dollars, because the city as a whole owns that utility, and getting a dividend from those entities to the owners is perfectly right, and we do it again with our other utilities. So it's not unusual, and certainly SWS, when they're sitting on several times more than what a normal reserve would be, that's when it's appropriate to do it. I'd just also like to remind folks that with this action, the Assembly has now, instead of taxing to the cap and actually reaching in to the ASD taxing capacity, you now are slightly below our cap, and you're not reaching into the ASD taxes at all. So that's, I think, a good, prudent move. Thank you for your support.
I've got one last Assembly comment. Mr. Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the mayor's comments, actually. And, of course, we have a relatively well-ordered process for dealing with MLNP and AWU in terms of MUSA and MISA. We don't have anything like that for solid waste services, particularly the collections utility. And so I know these are the waning days of your administration, Mr. Mayor, but if you want a little project, it would be worthwhile, I think, to start looking at how we better govern that process. This came at us pretty late in the game, and I think that's part of my discomfort and part of the reason I was a no vote on the final override, just because I don't think we handled this as well as we could have, and I'd appreciate a more disciplined approach to how we handle that. Not your fault, but something worth looking at.
Mr. Chair, if I could just respond. Thank you, Mr.
Mayor.
Flynn, for your comments. We do take a dividend from MLMP in addition to the MUSA. That's a 5% dividend. And your comments are timely because we had a discussion in our exec meeting today about setting up a more formal process with SWS so that there could be a defined dividend that, again, would be the policy going forward rather than just recognizing that they're carrying way too much cash and doing it ad hoc. We agree that there should be a set policy, and we'll be bringing that forward to you here in just a few weeks.
Ms. Gray Jackson has a question, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not necessary to the mayor, but we were handed out new document of AR 2015-107S as amended in 34. Do these documents represent the action that we just taken?
Through the chair, Ms. Gray Jackson, no. We had intended to hand those out at the beginning of the meeting so you could see what the Assembly had already approved.
Right.
That's what these are. We'll be working to create the final documents for the Assembly and the Clerk's
Right, and if I can follow up real quickly, I didn't think so, but I just wanted to make sure that people understood that, because we did an amendment to let you do your thing after the fact. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Steele, final comment, sir.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, my concern was how it was done, and taking 5% is a lot different than taking 200%, and so I'm still concerned about the process, but here we are.
I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Is there a second? We're adjourned.